All right. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. Happy to be um, building on some of the concepts that we've already heard about this morning as well as yesterday. Um, I work for Idaho National Laboratory. I live in El Paso, Texas, and today I will be talking about an exercise that we run in New York. So all over the country today, and I think this will build nicely on the previous talk discussing how do you start that incident response planning and doing the tabletop exercises. And I'm going to talk today about one of our projects where we bring that to the field and do a full-scale incident response exercise to see how our plans actually work in practice. So I'm going to start this with a motivating example. Show of hands, are there people familiar with the 2023 attack on the Danish energy sector? Okay, handful. So I'm going to kind of walk through this and the sector CERT report on this that talks a little bit about their incident response and the things that they saw as they were going through this. So on May 5th, there was a coordinated attack on 16 Danish energy companies. They were not all electric utilities, and some of them were kind of mixed utilities. This exploited a known vulnerability in a firewall, which is something that we've seen more and more common, I think. In particular, this exploit resulted in root privileges on the firewall and allowed them to execute arbitrary code. This was definitely coordinated. It all happened at the same time. Sector CERT got all of these alerts at the same time. It did so happen that the attacks only were successful on 11 of the targets. 5 of them were slightly misconfigured, and it didn't give that root privilege. In response to this, Sector CERT worked with these organizations to identify the attacked companies and monitor for any new ones. They alerted the affected members who may or may not have known about this. They worked with the suppliers to apply updates and patch those firewalls. This particular vulnerability had been disclosed about 2 weeks prior, so it was still fairly recent, and then share that information. It was a late night for these Sector CERT responders. They noted that they typically don't work 24/7, but on this incident they did, and they were able to apply the patches and recover the systems for those 11 companies within the day. So everything was great, right? We've solved the problem. We worked some long hours, but we fixed it. Well, less than 2 weeks later, they got some more alarms at Sector CERT. This first one showed them that there was software being downloaded to a firewall over an insecure connection. And I don't know if anyone will pick up on this, but there's actually a step missing there. They did not detect the initial intrusion into that firewall that allowed them to then download the software. So already they were surprised to see this, surprised that they missed the signs of initial compromise, and they were already downloading software onto these firewalls. Once they got privilege on that firewall, they turned it into a botnet or a member of a botnet that started targeting devices in the United States and Hong Kong with denial of service attacks. Pretty quickly, that utility entered an islanded mode. They shut down a lot of their remote communications and tried to start fixing that particular firewall. Within a few hours, a second member was attacked, and they had a similar response to enter an islanded mode of operation, shut down everything, and try to fix that firewall. A day later, we saw this on a third member. In this case, the payload that was downloaded was used to do brute force SSH attacks against a Canadian company. This is now day 3 of this second wave of attacks. We're seeing different types of payloads that are being downloaded, figuring out which one is going to work on those. Seeing additional members compromised. And it was on this day 3 that the vendor announced the vulnerabilities that were used. So actually this second wave of attacks had used a previously undisclosed vulnerability. And so it took the vendor a couple of days to get that information out and release a fix for it. After that, now that the vulnerability is published, there's actually more potential threat actors that are going to be leveraging that vulnerability. So we're seeing different payloads that are being downloaded onto these firewalls, these still unpatched firewalls, adding them to different botnets. One notable thing here was that they did detect slight activity that may indicate APTs. In particular, they saw that there were some packets being sent out from the firewalls to IP addresses that were associated with the sandworm team. That's really all the activity that was detected that could be tied directly back to an advanced persistent threat actor. And so they're not really, there wasn't any conclusion necessarily on whether we actually thought it was Russia doing these attacks or not. Before I do that, did want to point out too, one of these members did not know that they had the firewalls on their system. They were installed as part of an IP camera setup by a third party. And great, you you firewalled your cameras off from the rest of your system. That's great. But this was missing from the asset inventory. And to be honest, I'm not sure how the asset owner didn't know they had it, but Sector CERT still detected the activity. So obviously there was some monitoring in place that they had. See someone that might have the answer. Two-layer configuration that had the IDS probes behind the firewall. So there you go. All right. Still on, now we're on day 4 of the second wave of attacks, still seeing some compromises. In one of these, the member chose not to patch their firewall, which resulted, even though they were kind of fixing these as they popped up, this particular member continued to be compromised by different actors over the subsequent days because they had they didn't apply the patch. Overall, this was a kind of whack-a-mole game, it seemed like, for a little bit. And then once they kind of got these patches deployed and communicated the information out to everybody, they made sure that they coordinated with the other government agencies as well, sent analysts out to members to gather more field information, and started doing some reconnaissance where they shut down some of the connectivity, but kept the firewalls on so they could monitor what the threat actors were doing. In the subsequent days, there were even more attacks, although at that point it was described as a hail of bullets that didn't really have any significant responses or significant effects. So the things that we saw here were that the early intrusion signs are not always detected, even when we have good monitoring in place, that it's hard to be prepared even when you know it's coming. So these attacks continued to happen over several days. Obviously, they were targeting different organizations, but Sector CERT had communicated that information out, and it's possible that you could have anticipated that these threat actors were moving at that time. Cooperation is key, communicating with the government agencies and the members. And even though this was an incident response report, I thought it was interesting that they did call out the stress on their analysts and the effect that late hours had on their responses. Overall, what types of trends we're seeing in the energy sector? This was talked about a little bit yesterday, and I think this aligns with the phase 1, 2, 3 that we discussed in terms of malware becoming a lot more modular, targeting protocols rather than specific devices and configurations, and seeing more things that are accompanied by wipers to destroy evidence of the attacks along the way as well, or make recovery more difficult. In addition to that, we can look at some of the trends in vulnerabilities. My particular area that I study is often associated with clean energy, so that's what I know the most about. We're still seeing a lot of things that we think should be basic best practices. So still seeing things like weak credential vulnerabilities being disclosed, whether that's weak requirements or hard-coded credentials or passwords that are derived from things like the part numbers or the ID numbers of the devices, plain text storage of passwords, weak encryption. The other thing that we're seeing particularly in renewable energy, but I think in general as things become more and more digitized, is vulnerabilities associated with the web servers or cloud servers that host a lot of this information. In particular, a lot of these are associated with residential solar systems. So if you think about the app that you might use to monitor your home systems, there have been some disclosed vulnerabilities around some of those that can allow escalated privilege or even arbitrary execution of code, access to sensitive files and things like that. So knowing all of this, seeing the incidents that are happening, seeing the trends in malware, seeing the trends in vulnerabilities, how do we prepare to respond to these types of incidents, assuming we can't prevent all of them? we can practice. And so we've heard a little bit about preparing an incident response plan and tabletop exercises. I'm going to talk a little bit more about full-scale exercises, where our goal is to practice those plans, to validate the plans. Can we actually work through them correctly? Collaborate to test that. We talked about, do you know who to call? So looking at, do you actually, who do you call? Can we actually practice this? And how do you coordinate with other industries or other agencies, government, nonprofit, or private sector to handle these incidents? These are also an opportunity to improve, to see what works well and what doesn't, and find those areas to respond more efficiently, as well as to train. A lot of people may not have, there's some very experienced people in this room who have responded to incidents, real world incidents before, and some people haven't. And so putting people in that environment where they're forced to make some of those decisions under a little bit of pressure can be a good training exercise. So in particular, the project that I'm talking about today is called Liberty Eclipse. It's an annual cybersecurity preparedness exercise that brings together federal partners in operational technology and cybersecurity experts from the energy sector to validate the security of their cyber defense systems, plans, policies, and procedures in a scaled environment. That was a mouthful, but hopefully it aligns with what we were just talking about. We have the opportunity here to work with a medium voltage microgrid out in New York that is can be islanded from the utility system. So we kind of have our little playground to work with. We split this system up into 3 distribution utilities that it's connected by medium voltage transmission system. And then we have a red team led by INL that executes scenarios on the components in that power system that are found in real systems and requires coordinated response from the security teams, particularly the OT security teams in a SOC and the power operations team. So I've got a couple of things that I've kind of noticed as we've put these exercises together. Do you have the right people, tools, practice, and preparation? We've found that you need all 4 of these to have a successful response. There's been 2 full-scale Liberty Eclipse exercises so far, but this is also building on a program called Radix, run by DARPA, that did similar types of exercises. So we've had a lot of lessons learned from that as well. I think that's all I wanted to say there. So who do we have working on Liberty Eclipse? As I mentioned, we have 3 distribution utilities as part of our test bed. We invite real utilities to come participate. They may have each of our fake utilities will have a lead organization and 1 or 2 other organizations that may participate with them. So they get to work on new teams and practice some of that information sharing and peer-to-peer learning. Those utility teams will generally cover the ops center and the SOC. So we've got our power systems people coming in, as well as the OT security people coming in to do this coordinated response. They may be joined on their teams by strategic partners that could include things like cybersecurity vendors who are going to practice tuning their tools to the environment and demonstrating how they can be used to detect incidents. And then we also bring the National Guard in to support these teams as well. This is a mutually beneficial relationship where the National Guard gets a little bit more practice with OT systems that they normally wouldn't have access to, and the utilities get to practice some of that cyber mutual assistance and reaching out for help when they need it. The National Guard also helps us with data collection and self-evaluation, so seeing how well the utilities were able to execute their response plans. On the exercise team side, we've got 3 national laboratories and academic partners that do the program management, the network setup, the test bed setup, act as the red team, and also act as the white cell. And then we're joined by a couple of utility members who act as the balancing authority, controlling the generation, which is a couple of diesel generators and a small solar system and battery storage system to kind of manage that transmission system that connects the 3 utilities. What we've seen is that even though we bring out these teams specifically to practice their coordinated cyber physical incident response, there's still a little bit of gap between the people that are sitting in the SOC and the people that are sitting in that ops center. In particular, the SOC can detect some of the adversarial activity through network detection tools, but they don't really necessarily know how to interpret operationally. Their instinct is block that IP, block it, shut it down. We don't want to see that anymore. That's not a bad response, but what we push them to do is say, okay, but what if you hadn't detected that? We're going to leave that connection open. Now what do you do? How do you inform your operations team about what you're seeing in a way that they will be able to act on and respond from the physical side? And that's definitely a challenge for them. So we see that both in their instinct to want to shut things down and also to push them, even if they see the OT protocols in a context, in a small environment, they can't necessarily explain what those adversarial actions are doing or what they might be targeting. We see this on the other end as well. We had some scenarios where we bricked a couple of devices, specifically some RTACs. Is that right? RTUs? Yeah. Yeah. And the power systems people could say, I know that device is not working, but I don't know why. And they kind of said, well, that wouldn't be my job to figure out why. I don't really know what to do now. And again, we kind of pushed them to say, okay, but if this were a real world incident and you needed that device back up, who would you call? What would you do? How would you try to get support on this? So we're working to develop more of those cyber mutual assistance capabilities where they can send these samples, perhaps that they collect, send them off the island for examination by some partners, and get some information back to practice that information exchange. We ended up letting them put their hands on these devices, play around with them for about half a day, see what they could find before we had one of our red team members go in and explain what exactly had happened, how it had been done, how they might have discovered what had been done, and how they could have remediated what had been done. This is also an area that's of interest to DOE for future research. In particular, there was a FOA out this spring specifically to address forensic analysis of infected renewable systems. I'm sure there are others as well, but again, that one's kind of up my alley. Talking about people, processes, and tools, we make a lot of tools available for the utilities to use. And even though they often are excited about the availability of tools that they may not have seen before, they tend to want to use the ones that they are familiar with already. This makes sense. And obviously in your real environment, you're going to be using the tools that you are most familiar with and that have been tuned for your environment. Some of the challenges that we see with the new tools when we make them available is setup and configuration issues, being able to parse alerts and know what they mean, and then having that full network visibility. Security Onion is one of the tools we make available to participants, but there's others as well. And they can also bring their own tools if they have licenses and things that they want to test out. All right, next piece. You don't get the answer key ahead of time, but the exercise team does. This should make sense, but sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge to put all of these pieces together in a short period of time. One of the things that we do with Liberty Eclipse is we white card some things. We allow the red team to have access to some credentials or to some systems to pre-position some of their activities ahead of time. This allows us to demonstrate a full attack chain in a relatively short period of time. One of the things that we've added recently is a more robust enterprise network that has a bunch of different clients and some email servers to try to make that system a little bit noisier and a little bit more realistic so that the adversarial activity is hidden a little bit. But to be honest, we're still very noisy as a red team. We're focused on the OT systems. We want to demonstrate that pivoting through different clients and through the DMZ and that sort of thing. But our goal is not to be stealthy because we only have a week and we want to get to the interesting things. This allows us to kind of allow both the ops teams and the SOC teams to see activity at the same time. If we're focused purely on the reconnaissance or the initial points of entry, our power team might be fairly bored. We talked about this a little bit, but again, the instinct of the SOC teams was to shut it down. And what we asked them to do was that rather than shutting things down immediately, that they submit a change request and allow that to be processed and approved by the exercise team before it was implemented. That way, if there were things we could say, yep, you detected that, great job, please leave it open so we can continue with the exercise. Which was frustrating for some of the SOC team members because they wanted the gold star of like, yeah, I blocked them. So we have to kind of change the way that we think about some of that. There were some participants felt like the red team was cheating if they were pre-positioning things or if they had the credentials already. In fact, some of them, the very first thing they did when they got their hands on the systems was change all of the passwords that they could find. That's a great practice. I'm happy they did that. It hurt our red team because now the red team doesn't have an accurate view of what the system is, which again, from a realism perspective is fine. But from the intent of executing this exercise within a week and being able to get through all of the material that we've prepared, we want the red team to know what's going on and to be able to use those credentials that they've gathered. We can make the justifications that credential harvesting and that sort of thing is something that happens over the months ahead of time, and they would potentially have access to those credentials. That's probably not something you're changing on a daily basis. Nor am I suggesting that you should. Just trying to justify how this exercise looks like real life. The red team needs to be prepared. What is the preparation for the red team activity? One approach is for the participants to go in blind, that they don't know what's coming, that it's just a regular blue sky day, and they've got to be on the alert for anything that looks unusual, but they may not know what's coming. And this approach has led to but some things being missed. It's also led to some natural errors being classified as that must have been the red team because of equipment failures or different things like that on the island. Again, it's not their real environment, so it may be a little bit harder to tell what is normal activity and what is not. An intermediate step that we can provide is allowing them to have some information about what type of activity to look for. So themes for the day. This is something we're working on implementing this year, where specific sets of scenarios will be tied to particular threat actors rather than just throwing them anything out of the bag. And then there are also some participants who've requested that they know exactly what activity to look for and when, like down to the minute. The red team is going to execute this ransomware attack at 10:02. It's 10:01, it's 10:02. Yep, I saw it, I'm good. I've validated my tools. In my opinion, that's not really the goal of an incident response exercise. It should be a little bit unknown. It should catch you a little bit off guard. I understand it from the purpose of trying to validate tools, but that's something that we can do looking backwards as well. So if we have good data recording, we can go back at the logs and say, yep, the red team executed this at 10:02. I didn't know what it was exactly at the time, but I can see that now in my logs and I can tune appropriately. Red team resources, making sure the red team has the resources they need, adequate time to prepare and test everything on a system before they're actively fighting the blue team or the utilities that are participating too. It's not a hunt, it's not a penetration test exercise. The red team knows ahead of time what they will be doing and how and what and on what equipment to, again, make this a smooth process. So our goal here then is to communicate with the participants about what activity they're seeing from the red team in debriefs or even a little bit of purple teaming. We want it to be as realistic as possible. So our goal is not to make it too easy for the red team by opening up all the firewalls or doing anything like that. We want to consider, but we can't, sometimes we got to take a couple of shortcuts, right, to make this happen and to provide the exploits that we know how to do. So we've gotten some pushback on like, well, that's not the configuration that my device would have. That's not the firmware version that I have in the field. So anything you do with that is not relevant to me. I would push back on that a little bit and say, well, okay, but what can you learn from that? This is what we have to work with. Or the alternate approach there is we need to know ahead of time what type of equipment you do want to see so that we have adequate time on our red team to do that months and months of preparation and reconnaissance and developing of the scenarios so that you can see that activity on the equipment that the participants are interested in. Last point here is on gamification, focusing on the outcome that you're trying to get out of the exercise. We found that, it's not a red team, blue team exercise, but a little bit of that back and forth kind of helps everyone remember that they're on the same team and get some of that, I suppose, competitive aspect of it. But the goal is not to necessarily beat the red team. The goal is to, nor is it to beat all of the other teams that are there on the island. Those different utilities will be seeing different types of scenarios depending on what equipment they have and what their own individual goals that they bring to the exercise are. And our goal really is to learn, right? To see, what if I did miss that initial point of access? What would be the next thing that I would see? What could happen on the OT network that I may or may not be aware of? And this is something we're still working on as well, to find other motivating factors for utilities where they can get the gold stars and the wins from the situation, both for their staff, but also to go back and improve it at their own organizations. So really just making sure that everybody's on the same page about what the objectives are is important. All right, so I've talked about one specific exercise here that is run by the Department of Energy, but how could you take some of these lessons and apply them at your own organization? First piece here, talking about people. How well do your operations teams and your security teams, whether that's an IT security team or an OT security team, communicate? How can you build those relationships now to promote the mutual learning? One of the things I talked a little bit about how some of the SOC teams didn't necessarily know how to interpret the OT protocols or activity that they were seeing, even though they could detect it in the network. I kind of serve a similar role on the red team side. So when the red team says, well, I can attack any one of these breakers, which one should I go after? I've got the power systems background to be able to explain that. And so having that dialogue is important really on both sides. How are you testing the visibility of security tools to ensure that events of interest are captured? Sometimes when events are missed on the test bed, we get feedback like, well, we need different tools next year, or we need additional monitoring next year, or we would have caught that if. That's great. We can make those changes for next year. But if this is the real world, you don't get a do-over. So how do you ensure that your tools are properly positioned in your networks to capture the events of interest? What training scenarios are available to put staff in a new environment and practice communications? Can you practice how you will communicate with the government or with the National Guard or other cyber mutual assistance programs? How do you do peer-to-peer learning or information sharing? How do you do the coordination internally at your own organization? And how can you kind of add some of that pressure so that it feels like a real world response when you're going through some of these practice scenarios, as opposed to just another training? And then what are the objectives of your incident response practice? Is your goal to practice your incident response plan top to bottom? Is your goal to learn new things that you may not have seen before? Is your goal to train new staff who may not be familiar with some of these activities? So ensuring that you have clear objectives about what you're trying to get out of an incident response exercise is important. Last thoughts here, the full-scale exercises, as opposed to tabletops or other things that we can do, can put people under a little bit more pressure. It's still obviously a practice scenario, but you get to see how they respond, not just on paper, not just sitting in a chair in your regular office. The unique setup of this full-scale exercise allows us to do that IT-OT crossover, but what we've seen is that there's still some work to be done, even with that as the core objective, to have those IT and OT teams or that knowledge gap closed a little bit better. Clear rules and of engagement, and then realism improves the exercise, but it's not ever going to be entirely like a real incident, especially when we put it into a condensed timeline, which we need to do because we're not going to take months of somebody's time where they've got to be monitoring this exercise network in preparation for actually going out to the island and to see all those pre-positioning things on a timeline that would occur. We're condensing it. You know you're looking for activity. It's going to be a little bit more obvious, but that's kind of the point. All right, I think that's all I've got. I'm happy to take any questions.